this short presentation, I will provide a brief overview of... Non si sente? Of early medieval archaeological research in Styria, and explain the current state of research. But first, I would like to briefly discuss the late antique period in Styria in order to give a basic idea of the situation and the beginning of the early Middle Ages. In late antiquity, we have almost nothing. Our entire inventory regarding the 200 years between 450 and 650 consists of approximately 20 identified finds, most of which are associated with unclear circumstances. Even recent research has not been able to add to the corpus. Considering the extensive late antique and migration period finds from hilltop settlements and burials in Corinthia and Slovenia, the small number of finds from the same period in Styria is surprising, to say the least. The apparent depopulation of Styria after 450 is obviously not the result of insufficient research, which began over 180 years ago, but reflects historical reality. 19 years ago, Ulla Steinklauber titled an article on late antiquity of Styria, "Die Römer gehen," the Romans are leaving. Based on the above data, one can agree with this pointed choice of words. Based on the above data, one can only agree with this, it was not until the second half of the 8th century that Styria was reintegrated into a larger political and administrative structure in the course of the Frankish Carolingian expansion towards the east and the establishment of the new order. In between came the Slavs. So I think he was just showing all the late antique finds that they have. This is probably more or less what they do have in the coins. To give you an impression, a few sheets with the finds in quick succession. Okay, so I'm sorry, we have already seen this. Archaeological research into the early Middle Ages began in Styria in the second half of the 19th century, primarily with the discovery of early medieval burial grounds in Krungel, near Bad Mittendorf, and Hohenberg, near Aigen. However, the first finds had already come to light in Krungel, the most important and largest early medieval burial ground in Styria, in 1823. The oldest description of the finds mentioned a sword, but unfortunately this weapon is no longer available to scientists today, as well as the second sword from the year 1873. The occupation of the burial grounds in Krungel and Hohenberg began in the mid-8th century. The site in Krungel was used for more than 200 years, and the site in Hohenberg for at least 100 years. Both sites have yielded outstanding finds, which have been repeatedly mentioned in specialist literature. The best-known items are an Italo-Byzantine belt set and an early Carolingian spada of the Mannheim type from Hohenberg. I'm sorry, I'm not sure if these are in the sheets. No. In Krungel, a late Avar belt set has been found, as well as a cast cross fibula with rounded corners. These male graves are among the latest examples of the Grabelsdorf type. Men of social standing were buried there. The graves contained elements of Avar representative culture, such as belt sets, but also early Carolingian representative weapons and riding equipment. These graves need to be viewed in connection with the Gentile Slavic ruling class of the Carantanians, who were obviously under a certain influence from the two neighboring powers of Bavaria and Avaria. Also dating from the second half of the 19th century is the excavation of a 10th century grave on the Kirchberg hill in Judendorf Straßengel, which is interesting because of its mixed inventory, which is a combination of early Arpadian and Western jewelry. Now I think we have the Krungel sheets. Not sure. Okay. These were the two sites that I was describing, actually. In 1996, Dieter Kramer was able to draw a more detailed picture of an early medieval settlement in his overview map, which now also included a few settlements and defensive structures. But anyway, discoveries of larger early medieval burial grounds have remained the exception in the last 3 decades. Examples worth mentioning here are the burial ground uncovered beneath the old university in the center of Graz, burial ground near the Hallstatt period, Bleikornkügel in Steetwerk, and only 2 years ago, a completely unexpected discovery of a small group of graves in the area of the extensive late Bronze Age and early Hallstatt burial near Wildon. The early medieval finds of Carinthia, Carantania, were analyzed by Stefan Eichert about 15 years ago, and a typo-chronological sequence was proposed, which can also be adopted for Styria. In general, the Styrian finds from the burial grounds fit well with the early medieval finds known from the entire Eastern Alps and the Austrian Danube region. In the 8th and early 9th century, ceramic vessels, iron knives, fire strikers, belt buckles, mosaic eye bead necklaces, and spindle whorls, among other things, outline the finds among the common population. This is the group B, so the lower picture in this slide. Burials with pottery and animal bones as evidence of intentional food and drink offerings are most likely to be associated with pagan beliefs and rituals and can be traced back to the end of the first third of the 9th century. We must therefore assume that Christian and pagan populations coexisted for a few generations until around the middle of the 9th century. During the early 9th century, these objects disappeared rapidly from the repertoire of grave goods and are no longer found in church cemeteries. Parallel to the burials with intentional grave goods, however, we encounter another group of people in graves from the late 8th century, characterized by newly appearing elements of costume, such as headdress rings with S loops and functional hooks, headdress rings with hook and eye fastening, or early headdress rings with button ends and large diameters. Headdress rings with a bead pushed onto them and pendants which can be traced back to Western pom-pom headdress rings are a common feature in graves in the Eastern Alpine region. In addition, various types of fibulae, rectangular fibulae, crescent-shaped pressed sheet metal fibulae, fibulae with a hump, appear for the first time in the relevant costume repertoire, which no longer includes any objects of the late Avar Eastern origin. The lack of intentional burial objects let us assume that the members of this group of people were already largely Christianized. The finds thus reflect the changed power relations following the incorporation of Carinthia into the Bavarian Duchy in 772. Graves from this group are mainly found in church cemeteries, but can also occur in burial grounds without churches, as can be seen from finds in Styria, among other places. For example, Graz Old University. From the beginning, let me just see. From the beginning of the second third of the 8th century, we observed the start of a production of mass-produced goods, now made locally, but modeled on imported forms of groups B and C. This subsequently led to a standardization of fashion. The mass-produced cheap costume jewelry was not limited to the Carinthian region, but spread throughout the Eastern Alps, Slovenia, and parts of the Austrian Danube region as far as Germany, probably as a result of the expansion of the Carolingian Empire. During the second half of the 9th century, forged crescent-shaped headdress rings made of sheet metal begin to appear. The latest graves with grave goods in Styria include these with so-called mixed inventory, which means that the local jewelry is associated with objects from the transitional phase of the Arpadian period, such as crescent-shaped headdress rings and animal disc bridges. Such graves are mainly found in eastern Austria and in Slovenia, in the border area with Hungary, According to Martin Obernaus, these burial sites arose around the brief expansion period of the Hungarian sphere of influence in the western border region. The graves are mostly integrated into existing burial grounds of the indigenous population. In Styria, we have found one grave mixed inventory in Ludendorff Strasse in Sorry, not my slides. I'm not sure which one, if he's showing them. Okay. And we assume that they also existed in the cemetery of Leibniz-Altenmarkt. This is indicated exclusively by some early Arpad period finds from the cemetery area. Some of the Niederhofen grave objects are unique in Styria, such as the lunula pendant as an artifact in itself in the rosette finger ring due to the material used, it's white metal, and the way it was made, it was cast. The unfortunately tumultuously excavated cemetery in Leibniz-Altenmarkt is at least a burial ground that can be linked to a documented church, St. Martin's Church. First mentioned in 1170, and where burials took place over several centuries, more than 150 burials. The finds, most of which unfortunately without associated graves, suggest that the site was occupied as early as the 9th century, followed by continuous use until the 16th century. Evidence of early medieval church buildings can be found in the wattle stones from Mariahof and St. Lamprecht in the upper Murtal valley. Only in Unsmarkt Frauenburg are the remains of an early medieval church known to exist. The settlement of what would later become Styria by Slavs probably began in the last decades of the 6th century after the Lombards had withdrawn from the southeastern Alps to Italy in 568. Moreover, a Slavic settlement layer in Styria can also be concluded on the basis of toponyms. In its oldest cultural form found in Central Europe, the Prague culture, however, Slavic settlement in Styria is currently not archaeologically verifiable. Characteristic early Slavic cremation burials with urns of the so-called Prague type have not yet been found. Nevertheless, there are indications of the early Slavic settlement in Styria, limited in terms of material and findings and confined to western and central Styria, with ceramic finds from around 700, particularly at the sites of Comberg, St. Ruprecht an der Raab, Inzeldorf, and Fernitz. Judging from the ceramic material, settlement activity in the Don Unterhaus may also have begun during this period. Klein, Eichheck near Stahlhofen, and possibly Graz Straßgang might also fall within this horizon, but interpretations should be taken with a grain of salt due to the sparse ceramic finds. No metal objects have been found in any of these sites to date. Similar reservations apply to the sites such as Karlsdorf, Unterbremstetten, and Schönberg, where the number of shards is very small and the pottery from the first two sites cannot be reliably dated or classified. Again, early Slavic settlement in Styria before 650 cannot be proven by archaeological finds. Early medieval valley or lowland settlement have hardly been discovered in Styria to date. The only site that overlaps with Klein and Wildon Unterhaus in terms of time is the settlement in Weitendorf, located just a few kilometers west of the Wildon Castle Hill, which dates from the second half of the 8th and 9th centuries. According to current knowledge, early medieval burial grounds did not appear in Styria until the middle of the 8th century at the earliest, which is Hohenberg, Krumbel, and Niederhofen that we have seen, which means that the abandonment of the necropolis on the Frauenberg near Leibniz around 430 to 450, there is a period of around 300 years in which grave founds have not been documented for around 200 years. No confirmed settlement finds either. The finds from the early medieval settlements in high altitudes, which we would classify as early medieval fortifications, castles or kurtas. For example, the ones I think we will see, Kirchberg near Deutsch-Feistritz, Wildoner Schlossberg, Lichtskogel near Steins, Georgiberg near Kinderberg, date back to the Carolingian Ottonian period. Some of these, such as Deutsch-Feistritz, Kirchberg, show signs of use as early as late 8th century, while recent investigations in Wildon Schlossberg indicate that the early medieval pottery dates back to the middle of the 9th century. Deutsch-Feistritz. Oh. And Wildon Schlossberg. So what happened in the 60 years between the publication of Walter Modrian's distribution map and today? Well, it's safe to say that there has been a qualitative increase in the number of early medieval finds and sites dating from the early Middle Ages, but we still don't have a lot. A few settlement sites, Stein, Leitskogel, Schanberg, Alt-Burgstele, have been added in recent years, but no early medieval settlement has yet been systematically excavated in its entirety. Research into early medieval fortifications also lags significantly behind neighboring regions, for example, Lower Austria or Slovenia. It would also be nice to have larger sections of burial grounds available than the ones we have to work with in Lietzen, Trojafach, or Frohnleiten. The concentration of sites along the Enns and Mittelmoor valleys is hardly surprising, given the transport routes, nor is the settlement density in the greater Frohnleiten area, including Deutsch-Feistritz and Pegau. Only in recent decades have the areas around Leibniz become the focus of archaeological attention with the discovery of burial grounds and other early medieval finds and features, as has the area around Wildon and the burial ground at Gorizia in western Styria, also the upper Moor Valley. In contrast, the Mürz region and the entire Palgen-Liesing Valley must be considered pretty much unexplored. In eastern Styria, we have yet to find a single early medieval grave. So as you can see, as far as the early medieval period is concerned, large parts of Styria remain terra incognita. This is not for lack of trying, but for lack of funding. So I believe it is very clear what we need to focus on. Thank you. I think this is the end of the presentation.